Blood pooled in the grooves of ancient floorboards, seeping between cracks that had swallowed secrets for over a century. The mountain wind howled through broken windows of the Halberd homestead, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse. This is the story of why an entire bloodline's name was erased from maps, census records, and family Bibles across 3 states, and why those mountains still echo with whispers of what the Halberd clan did in the shadows of Appalachia. The year was 1897, when census taker Emmeline Ashford first climbed the narrow deer path that wound up Perdition Ridge. The morning mist clung to her wool coat like desperate fingers, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with something metallic that made her stomach turn. Each step on the frost-hardened earth sent small stones tumbling into the valley below, their echoes swallowed by the dense canopy of pine and oak. Emmeline had been documenting families across the Blue Ridge Mountains for 3 years, but nothing had prepared her for the isolation of this particular hollow. The local postmaster in Copper Falls had warned her about the ridge. Folks up there keep to themselves, Sylvester Radcliffe had muttered, avoiding her eyes as he stamped her official papers. Been that way since before the war. Some families, well, they got their own ways of settling disputes. What he didn't tell her was that no government official had successfully completed a census of Perdition Ridge in over 20 years. The Halberd compound appeared through the trees like a fever dream made manifest. 7 cabins clustered around a central clearing, their roofs sagging under the weight of moss and neglect. Smoke rose from only 3 chimneys, thin gray ribbons that seemed to dissolve before reaching the canopy. But it was the silence that struck Emmeline first. No children's laughter, no animal sounds, no conversation drifting between buildings. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant crack of settling timber. Josiah Halberd emerged from the largest cabin before she could announce herself. Tall and gaunt, with eyes the color of winter sky, he moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to being watched. His beard hung to his chest, streaked with premature gray, despite his apparent age of 40-some years. Behind him, barely visible in the cabin's shadow, stood a woman Emmeline would later learn was Winifred Harriman, Josiah's wife, and the keeper of the family's most terrible traditions. "Census business," Emmeline called out, her voice smaller than intended in the vast quiet of the clearing. She held up her leather satchel and official papers. "Just need to record names and ages for the Federal Registry." Josiah's lips curved into what might have been a smile on another man's face. On his, it looked like a wound. "Names," he repeated, tasting the word. "Ages." He stepped closer, and Emmeline caught the scent of fresh earth, clinging to his clothes earth, that had been recently disturbed. "Federal Registry, you say? Government wants to know who lives up here in the God-forgotten hills." Behind him, children began to appear, not running or playing as mountain children might, but emerging from doorways and from behind buildings with the calculated stealth of predators. Emmeline counted 7 at first, then 9, then 12. Their ages ranged from perhaps 6 to 16, but all shared the same unsettling stillness, the same winter sky eyes as their patriarch. The names Josiah provided that day would haunt Emmeline for the rest of her life. Ezekiel Broadmoor, aged 14, Helena Merriweather, aged 11, Quentin Blackthorne, aged 16. Each name spoken with the reverence most families reserved for Sunday prayers. But underneath, Emmeline sensed something else. These weren't just children. They were investments. Something was wrong with the mathematics of the family. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Emmeline noticed details that made her pencil hesitate over the census forms. Quentin bore no resemblance to Josiah or Winifred, his dark hair and olive complexion suggesting different parentage entirely. Helena's fine features and educated speech patterns seemed oddly refined for a mountain child who'd never left the ridge. And Ezekiel watched her with the calculating intelligence of someone far older than 14. his gaze never leaving her satchel, where she kept her travel documents and return route to Copper Falls. But perhaps most disturbing was what she didn't see. No family cemetery, no livestock beyond a few scraggly chickens, and no evidence of the extensive hunting or farming that should have sustained a clan of this size through harsh mountain winters. Death comes quietly to isolated places. When Emmeline asked about the missing census records from previous years, Josiah's expression shifted like clouds across the sun. "Government men," he said slowly, "sometimes lose their way in these mountains. Paths can be treacherous for those who don't know them proper." Emmeline's pencil snapped between her fingers as Quentin Blackthorne smiled at her with teeth too perfect for a mountain child who'd never seen a dentist. The sound echoed across the clearing like a gunshot, and every pair of winter blue eyes turned toward her with predatory focus. The federal government's missing census records weren't just bureaucratic oversights. They were evidence of a family that had learned to make problems disappear. The late afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for Emmeline like grasping fingers. The smell of wood rot and damp earth grew stronger as Josiah led her closer to the smaller cabins. But underneath it lurked something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of the slaughterhouse outside Copper Falls. Her boots squelched in patches of ground that seemed too soft, too dark for ordinary mountain soil. "Tell me about your schooling," Emmeline asked Helena Merriweather, attempting to maintain her professional composure despite the growing unease that crawled up her spine like ivy. The 11-year-old girl stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind her back, regarding the census taker with unsettling intensity. "I read Latin," Helena replied, in a voice devoid of childish inflection, "and Greek. Winifred teaches us about anatomy and preservation techniques. We learn which herbs slow the heart and which ones stop it entirely." The words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Emmeline's hands trembled as she made notes, trying to convince herself she'd misheard. Mountain children often learned unconventional skills. Hunting, tracking, herbal medicine, passed down through generations. But there was something in Helena's tone, a clinical detachment that belonged in a medical lecture hall, not in the mouth of a child who should have been playing with corn-husk dolls. From her periphery, Emmeline caught sight of Ezekiel Broadmoor emerging from what appeared to be a root cellar. His clothes were stained with dark patches that hadn't been there during the earlier introductions, and he carried something wrapped in oilcloth, something that dripped steadily onto the packed earth as he walked. When their eyes met, he didn't look away or offer explanation. Instead, he smiled with the confidence of someone who knew his secrets were safe. Government records from 1876 show that 3 previous census takers had attempted to document Perdition Ridge. Only one had returned to file a report, and Cornelius Whitman's final dispatch contained a single line: "The children here age backwards, and the dead teach Sunday school." "How long has your family lived on this ridge?" Emmeline asked Josiah, desperate to find some thread of normalcy in the increasingly surreal conversation. "Time moves different up here," he replied, gesturing toward the mountains that surrounded them like sleeping giants. "My grandfather's grandfather cleared this land. But the Halberd name? Well, that's newer. We take names as we need them, names from families who've moved on to other places." The implications of his words settled in Emmeline's stomach like lead shot. She glanced around the clearing again, this time noticing details that chilled her blood. Children's clothes hanging on lines but sized for adults. Shoes arranged by cabin doors that didn't match the feet she'd observed, and most disturbing of all, a small graveyard partially hidden behind the largest cabin where the headstones bore fresh dates but weathered names. Winifred Harriman finally spoke from her position in the cabin's shadow. Her voice carried the authority of a schoolmarm and the cold precision of an undertaker. "Miss Ashford, you look pale. Perhaps you'd like some tea before you continue your official duties." The way she pronounced official made it sound like a disease. As if summoned by invisible signals, the halberd children began to close ranks around Emmeline. Not threateningly, but with the coordinated movement of a pack that had practiced this formation many times before. Quentin positioned himself between her and the path down the mountain. Helena moved to block her view of the root cellar. Ezekiel approached from her left, still carrying his mysterious burden. But it was Honoria Southwell, a girl Emmeline had estimated at perhaps 10 years old, who delivered the most chilling revelation. "We've been waiting for you," she said in a voice that belonged to someone who'd lived far longer than a decade. "Winifred saw you coming in the smoke patterns 3 days ago. She always knows when new teachers arrive." Teachers, not census takers. Teachers. "What exactly do you teach here?" Emmeline managed to ask, though her throat felt like it was closing around the words. "Patience," Josiah replied. "Silence. The proper way to prepare for winter, when the hunting's been poor. How to make the most of what Providence provides." His gaze drifted to the trail she'd used to reach the ridge, then back to her satchel with its official papers and detailed maps of her planned route back to civilization. The sun was setting now, painting the clearing in shades of amber and rust. Emmeline realized with growing horror that she'd lost track of time during her interviews. The path down the mountain would be treacherous in darkness, and she'd told no one in Copper Falls exactly when to expect her return. How do you escape from people who've perfected the art of making visitors disappear? As shadows lengthened across the clearing, Emmeline noticed that some of the older children were no longer visible, but she could hear movement in the cabins around her, the soft scrape of metal against wood, and whispered conversations in a dialect she didn't recognize. Winifred Harriman's tea steamed in the gathering dusk, its surface reflecting the orange glow of lanterns that had appeared in cabin windows without anyone lighting them. The liquid smelled of mint and something medicinal that made Emmeline's eyes water. The federal government would never find her bones because the Halberd clan had turned disappearance into an art form perfected over 3 generations. The porcelain cup rattled against its saucer as Emmeline's hands shook. Around her, the children had arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle, their winter blue eyes reflecting the lantern light like coins at the bottom of a well. Josiah stood behind his wife, one weathered hand resting on her shoulder with the casual possessiveness of a man accustomed to owning everything within his domain. "Drink," Winifred urged, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a mother coaxing medicine into a sick child. "It will help with the altitude sickness. Visitors from the lowlands often struggle with our mountain air." Emmeline raised the cup to her lips, caught the scent of chamomile mixed with something sharper, something that reminded her of the ether her dentist used, and set it down untouched. "I should return to Copper Falls tonight. People will worry if I don't check in by morning." Lionel Brackett, a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, but spoke with the vocabulary of a college professor, tilted his head like a curious bird. "Which people, Miss Ashford? Your boarding house keeper, who thinks you've gone to survey the Patterson tract? Or the postmaster, who believes you're documenting families near Crow's Point? We find it helpful when visitors leave." Conflicting itineraries. The words hit Emmeline like physical blows. She had indeed told different people different stories about her destination, a precaution she'd learned after 3 years of documenting isolated families who valued their privacy. But how could these mountain children know the specifics of conversations she'd had in town? A church record from 1895 describes Prudence Vexley as a child wise beyond her years, taken to the mountains for her health. The same record notes that Prudence's family received a small inheritance shortly after her departure, just enough to cover funeral expenses for a daughter who was never officially declared dead. "We have excellent hearing," explained Absalom Winthrop, appearing from the shadows behind the largest cabin. At perhaps 16, he was the oldest of the children, his frame already showing the angular height that marked the Halberd bloodline. But his eyes held decades of careful observation, and his hands bore scars that spoke of work no 16-year-old should have mastered. "Sound carries differently in these mountains," he continued, approaching the circle with something wrapped in canvas, tucked under his arm. Conversations from the town square reach us on clear nights. We learn about visitors long before they learn about us. Emmeline's census papers felt suddenly heavy in her satchel. Every name she'd recorded, every address and travel plan, they already knew it all. The federal forms that had seemed so official and protective this morning now felt like invitations to her own disappearance. The temperature dropped with the sun, and frost began forming on the cabin windows despite the season being early autumn. Eugenia Withrow, a pale girl of perhaps 13, brought Emmeline a woolen shawl that smelled of lavender and old books. "The nights turn cold quickly here," she said with practiced kindness. "Winifred insists guests stay comfortable during their education." That word again. Education. Not visit, not documentation, but education. As if Emmeline's arrival was part of some curriculum these children had been studying for years. "What exactly are you educated in?" Emmeline asked, desperate to maintain some semblance of normal conversation, despite the growing certainty that nothing about this place was normal. Felix Claiborne, barely visible in the gathering shadows, spoke without moving closer to the lantern light. Anatomy, preservation techniques, the 17 different ways to drain a body completely, how to cure meat properly so it doesn't spoil during transport. The casual delivery of these words, spoken with the same tone another child might use to describe arithmetic lessons, sent ice water through Emmeline's veins. Some education leaves marks on the soul. Papa Josiah says knowledge is precious, added Augusta Ravensdale, the youngest visible child at perhaps 8 years old. But some knowledge can only be learned through practical application. Winifred rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to a cabinet that stood against the cabin's far wall. The wood was stained dark with age and use, its surface carved with symbols that belonged to no alphabet Emmeline recognized. From within, she withdrew a leather journal, bound with what appeared to be strips of dried sinew. "We keep excellent records," Winifred announced, opening the journal to reveal pages covered in precise handwriting. "Every visitor, every lesson, every preservation technique perfected. The federal government appreciates thoroughness, does it not?" She began to read aloud. Cornelius Whitman, census taker, 1876. Excellent bone structure, adequate muscle development. Preservation time, 47 days. Jeremiah Hollows, tax assessor, 1882. Poor condition upon arrival. Limited educational value. Marcus Webb, surveyor, 1891. Outstanding specimens, contributed significantly to advanced anatomical studies. Each name was followed by detailed notes written in the clinical language of a medical textbook. But the implications were unmistakable. These weren't records of visits, they were inventory logs. What would you do when faced with a family that had turned murder into a multi-generational curriculum where children learned human anatomy through hands-on experience with federal employees who trusted their official papers to protect them? As full darkness settled over Perdition Ridge, Emmeline realized that the lanterns hadn't been lit by the children they had been burning before her arrival, prepared for a guest whose accommodation had been planned long before she'd climbed that first deer path. The Halberd clan had been expecting her, and everything from the children's positioning to Winifred's prepared tea had been choreographed like a theatrical performance. But this wasn't theater, it was a harvest, and Emmeline was about to discover that her education was scheduled to begin at precisely 9:47 that evening. The grandfather clock in Winifred's parlor chimed 9:47, its bronze bells cutting through the mountain silence like a dinner bell summoning hungry ghosts. Emmeline's official papers scattered as she lurched backward, finally understanding that the timepiece wasn't marking the hour, it was announcing the beginning of her education. This was the moment when census taker became curriculum, when federal authority dissolved into the ancient hunger that had sustained the Halberd clan for 3 generations. The children moved with practiced precision, their earlier stillness transforming into coordinated motion that spoke of countless rehearsals. Quentin Blackthorne produced coils of rope from beneath his jacket, while Helena Merriweather began arranging surgical instruments on a cloth-covered table that had appeared from nowhere. The implements gleamed in the lantern-light bone saws, scalpels, and devices Emmeline couldn't identify, but whose purpose she understood with horrible clarity. "Please," she whispered, backing toward what she hoped was the cabin door. "I have money. My family will pay whatever you want." Josiah's winter blue eyes reflected genuine puzzlement. "Money?" He spoke the word like it belonged to a foreign language. "Miss Ashford, you misunderstand our needs entirely. We have no use for currency in these mountains. What we require cannot be purchased, only harvested." The smell of medicinal herbs grew stronger as Winifred approached, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She carried a small leather case that clinked softly with each step, the sound of metal instruments settling against one another. "Education requires fresh specimens," she explained, with the patience of a school teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Preservation techniques, anatomical study, the proper methods of extracting useful materials. These skills demand constant practice." Behind her, the children formed a living wall between Emmeline and the door. But they weren't rushing, weren't showing the excitement or bloodlust she might have expected from young killers. Instead, they displayed the calm focus of students preparing for an important examination. A ledger, discovered in 1899 by state investigators, contained this entry: "The Halberd educational method requires subjects of varying ages and physical conditions. Federal employees provide optimal specimens due to their documented health examinations and reliable nutritional standards." "You're teaching them to be murderers," Emmeline gasped, her voice barely audible over the hammering of her own heartbeat. "We're teaching them to survive," Josiah corrected. "These mountains don't forgive weakness or squeamishness. Winter comes hard to Perdition Ridge, and store-bought provisions spoil or run out. But a family that understands proper preservation techniques, anatomical preparation, and resource management, such a family endures when others starve." The horrifying logic of his words began to dawn on Emmeline. This wasn't random violence or sadistic pleasure killing. The Halberd clan had systematized cannibalism, turned it into a sustainable practice that could feed an extended family through harsh mountain winters. They'd created an educational system designed to pass these skills to the next generation with clinical efficiency. Ezekiel Broadmoor stepped forward, carrying what appeared to be a medical textbook. The pages fell open to detailed anatomical drawings annotated in multiple handwritings, generations of Halberds adding their observations to the margins. "Winifred teaches us which cuts yield the most nutrition," he explained with the enthusiasm of a promising pupil. "Papa Josiah shows us preservation methods that keep stores fresh for months. The little ones learn by watching first, then helping with smaller tasks. Education in methodical harvest." "How many?" Emmeline asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted the answer. "How many people have you educated ourselves upon?" Winifred consulted her sinew-bound journal, flipping through pages covered with names and clinical notations. "Since I married into this family in 1871, we've successfully processed 43 specimens. Federal employees provide the best learning opportunities. Their documentation helps us understand their physical condition before processing begins." The casual use of processing sent bile rising in Emmeline's throat. These people had reduced human beings to livestock, complete with quality assessments and yield calculations. Prudence Fexley, the girl who'd supposedly been brought to the mountains for her health, approached carrying a small wooden box. "We save tokens," she announced, opening the container to reveal an array of personal effects: pocket watches, spectacles, wedding rings, brass buttons from official uniforms. "Winifred says, it's important to remember our teachers. even after the lessons are complete. The box contained fragments of 43 lives, trophies from federal employees who'd climbed Perdition Ridge with official papers and absolute confidence in their government's protection. Now their possessions were teaching aides in a curriculum devoted to their own consumption. "The Spencer family down in Copper Falls," Emmeline said desperately, grasping for any connection to the outside world. "They'll send search parties if I don't return." Lionel Brackett consulted a hand-drawn map covered with notes and symbols. "The Spencers received word yesterday that you'd extended your survey to cover additional territories in the southern counties. Your thoughtful telegram explained that the work might take several weeks longer than anticipated. They'd been forging communications, maintaining correspondence with the outside world to explain away extended absences. The system was more sophisticated than simple murder. It was elaborate deception designed to buy processing time. How long can a person scream before their voice fails completely? And would anyone in these isolated mountains hear the sound?" As the children completed their preparations, Emmeline noticed details that spoke to the horrible efficiency of their methods. Leather aprons hanging on pegs, sharpened blades arranged by size and function, and what appeared to be a drain system built into the cabin floor. This wasn't an improvised killing, it was a purpose-built facility for converting human beings into winter provisions. But as Winifred approached with her first medical instrument, something unexpected happened that would change everything the Halberd clan thought they knew about their newest student. Emmeline's hand found the concealed derringer in her boot just as Winifred raised the bone saw, its serrated edge catching the lantern light like a smile full of broken teeth. The federal government hadn't sent her to these mountains unprepared. They'd armed her with more than official papers and bureaucratic authority. The Halberd clan had spent decades perfecting their educational methods, but they'd never encountered a student who'd come prepared to teach her own lessons in violence. The small pistol bucked in Emmeline's grip as she fired, the sound exploding through the cabin like thunder trapped in a bottle. Winifred spun backward, her medical instruments scattering across the floor as she crashed into the herb cabinet. Glass jars shattered, filling the air with the scent of dried flowers and something medicinal that made the children's eyes water. But instead of panic or fear, the Halberd clan reacted with what could only be described as professional curiosity. "Fascinating," murmured Josiah, stepping over his wife's writhing form to examine the wound. "Clean entry, minimal, powder burn." She was carrying concealed, which suggests federal training beyond standard census protocols. The children gathered around their fallen teacher with the detached interest of medical students observing a demonstration. Helena Merriweather produced a leather satchel and began extracting bandages, while Quentin Blackthorne helped position Winifred for optimal access to the bullet wound. Their movements were efficient, practiced, devoid of the emotional responses normal children might display when witnessing violence. "Government agents," Absalom Winthrop observed, his winter blue eyes fixed on Emmeline's defensive stance. "We should have recognized the signs earlier. The conflicting stories, the detailed knowledge of census procedures, the way she observed our preservation facilities without visible distress." Emmeline backed toward the cabin door, her remaining bullet ready, but her confidence shaken by their clinical reaction to violence. She'd expected screaming, chaos, perhaps enough confusion to facilitate escape. Instead, she faced a family that treated gunshot wounds like teaching opportunities. Federal records from 1903 indicate that the Treasury Department had begun training census takers in basic combat techniques after multiple agents vanished in remote territories. Emmeline Ashford was part of an experimental program designed to investigate suspicious disappearances under the cover of routine documentation. The training was inadequate, Eugenia Withrow noted, applying pressure to Winifred's shoulder wound with the efficiency of an experienced field medic. Single-shot derringer, obvious concealment location, panic firing instead of strategic targeting, government preparation focused on documentation rather than survival. Winifred coughed, blood speckling her lips, but her voice remained steady. Excellent. Learning opportunity, she wheezed. Children, observe the wound channel. Note the difference between training injuries and combat application. Even dying, she was teaching. The horror of their response crystallized in Emmeline's mind. This wasn't a family that killed for survival or twisted pleasure. They were scientists conducting human experiments with the methodical precision of university researchers. Every murder was data collection. Every victim a specimen contributing to their understanding of human anatomy and preservation techniques. How many agents have you killed? Emmeline demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of revelation. Felix Claiborne consulted a separate ledger, his young fingers tracing columns of names and classifications. 14 confirmed government operatives since 1875. Revenue agents, postal inspectors, territorial surveyors, census takers, each provided valuable insights into federal training protocols and equipment standards. They were learning from their victims, analyzing government methods to improve their own security measures. The Halbert clan wasn't just surviving in isolation. They were evolving, adapting, becoming more sophisticated with each federal employee they processed. Some predators studied their prey. Papa Josiah, Augusta Ravensdale, called from her position near the shattered herb cabinet. Winifred's breathing is becoming irregular. Should we prioritize medical intervention or educational observation? The casual discussion of whether to save or study their teacher's death throes revealed the complete absence of normal human emotional responses. These children had been raised in an environment where human life existed solely as educational material. Josiah considered the question with the careful deliberation of a professor weighing academic priorities. Educational observation, he decided. Winifred has always emphasized that learning opportunities should take precedence over sentiment. Document the progression carefully. Emmeline watched in horror as the children arranged themselves around their dying teacher, some taking notes while others sketched the wound's appearance at different stages of blood loss. They were conducting a live autopsy, treating Winifred's death as a final lesson in their horrific curriculum. "You're not human," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "We're evolved," Lionel Brackett corrected. "Adaptation requires discarding inefficient emotional responses. Sentiment interferes with logical analysis, reduces educational effectiveness." The clinical language couldn't disguise what they'd become. A family that had systematically eliminated empathy, compassion, and basic human connection in favor of predatory efficiency. They weren't just cannibals, they were a new species that had abandoned humanity entirely. But as Winifred's breathing grew more labored, something shifted in the children's expressions. Not grief or fear, but anticipation. They were waiting for something, some signal that Emmeline couldn't interpret. What ritual marks the transition from teacher to specimen? And why were the children watching their dying matriarch with such eager expectation? At 9:58, exactly 11 minutes after the grandfather clock had chimed, Winifred Harriman spoke her final words, not to her family, but to Emmeline. The real education begins when the teacher stops breathing. Winifred's final breath rattled through the cabin like autumn wind through dead leaves, and the moment her chest stopped rising, every child in the room turned toward Emmeline with expressions that had transformed from clinical interest to ravenous hunger. The death hadn't ended their education. It had begun the final examination. The Halbert clan had just lost their most experienced instructor, but they'd gained something far more valuable, a live specimen who understood their methods and could provide advanced lessons in federal resistance techniques. The children moved with synchronized precision that spoke of countless rehearsals for exactly this scenario. Quentin Blackthorne and Absalom Winthrop flanked the cabin door, while Helena Merriweather and Ezekiel Broadmoor approached from opposite sides, their movements calculated to eliminate escape routes without appearing overtly threatening. But it was Josiah's reaction that chilled Emmeline's blood. He knelt beside his wife's body and began whispering what sounded like prayers, except the words were anatomical terms spoken with religious reverence. Winifred always said the most valuable education comes from processing those who understand our methods, Eugenia Withrow observed, her pale hands already reaching for the surgical instruments scattered by the gunshot. Government agents provide superior learning opportunities because they fight back with training and technique rather than simple panic. The smell of blood, mixed with medicinal herbs, filled the cabin's close air, but underneath it lurked something else, the scent of anticipation, like the moment before lightning strikes. Emmeline realized that Winifred's death hadn't disrupted their plans, it had accelerated them. The children were no longer following a practiced curriculum. They were improvising, adapting, demonstrating the evolutionary flexibility that had kept their family alive for generations. The preservation techniques, Felix Claiborne announced, consulting notes written in multiple hands across several decades, indicate that subjects who die from trauma require immediate processing to prevent tissue degradation. But living subjects allow for extended educational observation. They were discussing her death with the casual tone of students planning a science project. Emmeline raised her derringer toward Josiah, but her hand trembled as she calculated the mathematics of survival. 1 remaining bullet, 12 targets, and a mountain wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. Even if she could fight her way out of the cabin, the Halberd children knew these trails better than she knew her own neighborhood streets. A report filed by the Bureau of Investigation in 1904 described the Perdition Ridge area as unsurveyable due to hostile terrain and unreliable local cooperation. The same report recommended that all future federal operations in the region be conducted by armed teams rather than individual agents. Papa Josiah, Prudence Vexley called from her position near the medical supplies. Should we follow Winifred's standard protocols, or would this be an appropriate time to attempt the advanced preservation methods she'd been developing? The question hung in the air, like incense at a black mass. Emmeline understood that she wasn't just facing death. She was about to become the subject of experimental procedures that would push the boundaries of their horrific expertise. Josiah rose from beside his wife's body, his winter blue eyes reflecting a depth of calculation that belonged in a university laboratory rather than a mountain cabin. Winifred spent years developing techniques for conscious preservation, he said slowly, methods that maintain specimen viability while allowing for extended anatomical study. This would be the ideal opportunity for practical application. The children exchanged glances that mixed academic excitement with predatory anticipation. They were about to graduate from theoretical study to hands-on experimentation, using Emmeline as their dissertation subject. Some lessons require living laboratories. The federal training manuals. Lionel Brackett continued, producing a leather portfolio from beneath the floorboards, contained detailed information about agent communication protocols, backup procedures, and search parameters. Processing her slowly would allow us to extract operational intelligence while conducting anatomical research. Emmeline's blood turned to ice water as she realized they possessed stolen government documents. The Halberd clan hadn't just been killing federal agents. They'd been studying their methods, learning their procedures, building a comprehensive understanding of how the federal government operated in remote territories. "How long have you been planning this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. "Since the moment you told conflicting stories in Copper Falls," Augusta Ravensdale replied with the matter-of-fact tone of a child reciting multiplication tables. "Winifred taught us to recognize federal surveillance patterns, inconsistent cover stories, excessive documentation, subjects who observe details without emotional response. These indicate government training." They'd identified her as a federal agent before she'd even reached the ridge. The entire encounter had been a carefully orchestrated trap designed to capture exactly the kind of specimen they needed for their advanced studies. The grandfather clock chimed 10:15, its bronze notes cutting through the cabin's suffocating atmosphere. But this time, the sound triggered a different response from the children. Instead of coordinated movement, they began to hum a low, harmonious melody that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Winifred's preservation lullaby, Josiah explained, his voice taking on an almost parental warmth. She composed it to calm subjects during extended processing procedures. The melody contains specific frequencies that induce relaxation while maintaining consciousness. The humming grew louder, more complex, as additional voices joined the unholy chorus. Emmeline felt her muscles beginning to relax against her will, her grip on the derringer loosening despite her desperate attempts to maintain focus. The sound was working on her nervous system, like auditory anesthesia, but as the melody reached its crescendo, something unexpected interrupted the Halbert family's carefully orchestrated ritual, the sound of boots on the cabin's front porch, accompanied by voices that belonged to people who definitely weren't part of their mountain education program. What happens when the hunters become the hunted? And how had the outside world finally found its way to Perdition Ridge? The humming stopped abruptly as Josiah raised his hand for silence. His head tilted toward the door like a wolf scenting the wind, and Emmeline realized that the Halbert clan's greatest fear wasn't federal agents or government interference. It was the possibility that their educational methods might finally face examination by peers who understood their end-day techniques. The cabin door exploded inward as three figures in matching wool coats stepped through the splintered frame, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd rehearsed this entrance for decades. But these weren't federal agents or mountain rescue. They were teachers arriving for a scheduled consultation. The Halbert clan's educational methods weren't unique to Perdition Ridge, and Emmeline was about to discover that cannibalistic curriculum had spread throughout the Appalachian mountain system like a contagion passed between isolated families. The newcomers moved with the same calculated precision Emmeline had observed in the Halbert children, their winter blue eyes scanning the cabin's interior with professional assessment. The eldest, a woman of perhaps 50, with silver hair braided in intricate patterns, surveyed Winifred's body without visible emotion before turning her attention to the scattered surgical instruments. "Constance Blackwood," she announced to Josiah, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "We received word about tonight's advanced demonstration and came to observe. The Meridian Ridge families have been developing similar preservation techniques." Behind her stood two younger figures who could have been Halbert children based on their pale complexion and unsettling stillness. But their clothes bore stains that spoke of recent educational activities, and they carried leather satchels that clinked with the sound of metal instruments. "Thaddeus brought specimens from the Crow's Hollow settlement," Constance continued, gesturing toward a boy of perhaps 14, whose hands were stained dark to the wrists. "3 traveling salesmen who made the mistake of seeking shelter during last week's storm. Excellent anatomical diversity for comparative studies." The implications crashed over Emmeline like avalanche snow. The Halbert clan wasn't an isolated aberration. They were part of a network, a confederation of families who'd transformed cannibalism into an educational system that spanned multiple mountain communities. Church records from 1901 describe unusual cooperation between previously isolated mountain families, marked by increased travel between settlements and shared educational resources. The same records note a corresponding increase in missing persons reports from commercial travelers in the region. "Sister Winifred appears to have encountered complications," observed the third newcomer, a girl whose age was impossible to determine, but whose vocabulary suggested advanced education. She knelt beside the body with clinical detachment, examining the bullet wound with the expertise of someone who'd studied similar injuries extensively. "Federal agent," Josiah explained, nodding toward Emmeline's defensive position near the herb cabinet. Winifred identified the classification early, but the specimen proved more resistant than anticipated. The casual discussion of her impending death sent ice through Emmeline's veins. But what horrified her more was the realization that these families had been sharing information, developing standardized methods for identifying and processing government agents. The Richmond Hollow Collective processed 2 revenue agents last month, Constance reported, consulting a leather journal that appeared identical to Winifred's record book. Both provided excellent material for advanced preservation studies. The techniques we've developed for maintaining conscious specimens during extended procedures show promising results. They were comparing notes, like university professors discussing research methodologies. Thaddeus approached Emmeline with the confidence of someone who'd participated in countless similar scenarios. Federal training protocols have improved since the Patterson incident, he observed, studying her defensive stance with academic interest. Note the concealed weapon placement, the strategic positioning, the attempt to maintain visual contact with multiple subjects simultaneously. Knowledge shared becomes power multiplied. The Ashford specimen represents an opportunity for collaborative research, Constance announced, her tone taking on the enthusiasm of a teacher introducing an exciting lesson plan. Multiple families working together could extract maximum educational value from a single subject. The Halberd children gathered closer, their expressions mixing familial pride with anticipation. They were about to participate in an advanced seminar conducted by visiting experts using Emmeline as the primary teaching material. "How many families?" Emmeline asked, her voice barely steady enough to form words. "How many of you are there?" 17 confirmed educational cooperatives throughout the Appalachian system, replied the unnamed girl, consulting notes written in multiple handwritings. From the Tennessee valleys to the Virginia highlands, each family specializes in specific preservation techniques, but we share knowledge through regular consultations. 17 families, hundreds of missing persons over decades, all processed through an educational network that had turned human consumption into a systematic academic discipline. The federal government had been tracking isolated incidents without recognizing the coordinated nature of the disappearances. "The autumn gathering is next week," Thaddeus added, his young voice carrying the excitement of a student anticipating a field trip. Families from across 3 states will convene to share recent developments in anatomical study and preservation methodology. The Ashford specimen could provide demonstration material for the entire conference. Emmeline's remaining bullet felt inadequate against the scope of what she faced. This wasn't a single family of murderers. It was an educational institution that had been operating under federal oversight for decades without detection. "Papa Josiah," Helena Merriweather interrupted, her pale face reflecting concern for the first time since Emmeline's arrival. "If multiple families participate in processing, how do we divide the educational material equitably?" The question sparked immediate discussion among the children and visitors. They began consulting journals, comparing notes, debating the logistics of collaborative specimen processing with the seriousness of graduate students planning a research project. But as their attention focused on academic protocols, Emmeline noticed something that offered a slim thread of hope. Constance Blackwood's leather satchel had fallen open, revealing not just surgical instruments, but official documents bearing federal seals and territorial stamps. How many government agents had these families captured, and what intelligence had they extracted during their extended educational procedures? As the Mountain families debated the finer points of collaborative preservation techniques, Emmeline realized that her knowledge of federal operations might be the only thing keeping her alive, because these educators had questions that only a living specimen could answer. But the grandfather clock's next chime would signal the beginning of interrogation methods that made simple murder seem merciful. The grandfather clock struck 10:37 as Constance Blackwood spread the stolen federal documents across Winifred's blood-stained work table, each page representing months of intelligence extracted from previous specimens through methods that redefine the boundaries of human endurance. Emmeline recognized territorial maps, agent communication codes, and operational protocols that should have been impossible for mountain families to obtain. The network of cannibalistic educators had been systematically harvesting federal secrets for decades, building an intelligence apparatus that rivaled anything the government itself had developed. The Patterson interrogation yielded communication frequencies for the entire Southern District, Thaddeus reported, his young fingers tracing classified routing information with practiced familiarity. 7 families coordinated the extraction over 43 days of conscious preservation. We learned that federal response protocols assume individual incidents rather than coordinated operations. The casual mention of 43 days of torture sent Emmeline's mind reeling. These families hadn't just perfected murder, they'd developed extended interrogation techniques that kept subjects alive and conscious far beyond normal human endurance limits. The autumn gathering will focus on information synthesis, Constance continued. Her silver-braided head bent over schedules written in multiple hands. Each family contributes intelligence extracted from their specimens. We're developing a comprehensive understanding of federal territorial operations. Behind her, the unnamed girl began arranging surgical instruments with the precision of someone preparing for a complex medical procedure. But these weren't healing tools. They were implements of extended questioning, designed to extract information while maintaining specimen viability. The Meridian Ridge families developed techniques for conscious bone removal, she announced with academic pride. Subjects remain aware and responsive for educational purposes, while providing anatomical material for preservation studies. Some knowledge comes with too high a price. Emmeline forced herself to study the documents scattered across the table, searching for any information that might provide advantage or escape opportunity. But what she discovered made her blood freeze in her veins. The federal government hadn't just been losing individual agents. Entire communication networks had been compromised, territorial strategies had been exposed, and operational security had been systematically dismantled by families who treated classified intelligence like textbook material. The spring conference identified 17 federal safe houses throughout the mountain territories, Josiah added, consulting notes written in Winifred's careful handwriting. Each location was compromised through information extracted during extended educational procedures. They weren't just killers or cannibals. They were enemy operatives who'd infiltrated federal territorial operations without ever leaving their mountain hollows. Miss Ashford, Constance addressed her directly for the first time, winter blue eyes fixed on Emmeline's defensive position. Your training includes communication protocols for missing agent procedures. The extraction of this information will require approximately 14 days of conscious preservation. 14 days. 2 weeks of remaining aware while they systematically dismantled her body for anatomical study and extracted every detail of federal operations from her mind. The children from both families gathered closer, their expressions mixing anticipation with professional curiosity. They were about to witness advanced interrogation techniques that represented decades of refinement and collaboration between educational cooperatives. The Richmond Hollow Collective will arrive tomorrow, Thaddeus announced, checking a schedule marked with symbols Emmeline couldn't interpret. They're bringing preservation equipment for extended specimen maintenance. The Crows Point families will contribute anatomical expertise. A convention. They were organizing a professional conference using her as the primary demonstration subject. Federal records discovered in 1906 described systematic communication failures throughout Appalachian territorial operations, suggesting coordinated opposition rather than environmental hazards. The same records recommended complete operational restructuring to address apparent intelligence compromise of unknown origin. How long have you been doing this? Emmeline asked, desperate to understand the scope of what she faced. The Educational Cooperative was established in 1849, Constance replied, consulting what appeared to be a historical ledger. Initial families developed preservation techniques independently, but collaborative research began after the first territorial surveys started bringing federal specimens into our educational territories. 50 years, half a century of systematic intelligence extraction hidden under the cover of isolated mountain communities. The federal government had been operating blindly in territories where every communication, every agent, every operational detail was being harvested by families who turned espionage into a hereditary craft. The children learned by observation first, Josiah explained, his paternal pride evident as he watched the young ones prepare their instruments. Advanced techniques require years of study before practical application. Miss Ashford will provide learning opportunities for students at multiple educational levels. But as the Mountain families completed their preparations for extended questioning, Emmeline noticed something that offered unexpected hope. The stolen federal documents included emergency protocols. She recognized procedures that indicated other agents were already positioned in the region. What happens when the hunters discover they've been walking into a trap of their own? And how long before backup arrives for an agent whose disappearance was expected from the beginning? The grandfather clock prepared to chime again, but this time its bronze notes would announce the beginning of interrogation procedures that would test whether federal counterintelligence had finally found a way to penetrate the Appalachian educational network. The sound of horses moving through mountain undergrowth echoed across Perdition Ridge like thunder before the storm, and through the cabin's shattered windows came the unmistakable metallic clicks of rifle bolts being chambered by people who understood exactly what they would find inside. The federal government had finally learned to speak the Mountain family's language. Overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The Halberd clan and their visiting educators were about to discover that their decades of intelligence gathering had provided the very information needed to destroy them. Constance Blackwood's silver-braided head snapped toward the windows as systematic bootfalls surrounded the cabin. These weren't the fumbling steps of lost travelers or the cautious approach of individual agents. This was coordinated military movement, executed by people who'd studied every trail, every hiding place, every escape route the families had used for 50 years. Federal cavalry, Thaddeus whispered, his young voice cracking for the first time since his arrival. Multiple units, positioned for complete containment. The children, who'd maintained perfect composure throughout discussions of preservation techniques and extended interrogation, suddenly looked their actual ages frightened, cornered, realizing that their educational superiority meant nothing against opponents who'd finally learned their methods. Through the splintered door frame stepped Major William Cassidy, his blue uniform marking him as regular Army rather than the civilian agents the families had grown accustomed to processing. Behind him came 12 soldiers carrying Spencer repeating rifles, their movements coordinated with military precision that left no room for the psychological manipulation the Mountain families had perfected. "Citizens of Perdition Ridge," Cassidy announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen action in territories where negotiation meant death. "By order of the Treasury Department, this compound is under federal investigation for crimes against government personnel." The stolen documents scattered across Winifred's work table suddenly took on new significance. Emmeline realized that every classified paper, every communication frequency, every operational detail the families had extracted during their educational procedures had been carefully cataloged and studied by federal intelligence. A War Department memorandum from 1905 authorized special territorial operations to address systematic loss of federal personnel in Appalachian regions, with particular attention to coordinated opposition activities, indicating hostile organization rather than individual criminal acts. "The Patterson interrogation," Josiah said slowly, his winter blue eyes fixed on the major's brass buttons. "How much did he tell you before he died?" Cassidy's expression revealed nothing, but his response chilled the mountain air. "Agent Patterson didn't die, Mr. Halberd. He survived 43 days of your educational procedures and provided detailed intelligence about 17 family cooperatives, their preservation techniques, and their communication networks. The implications crashed through the cabin like wildfire. Patterson had endured everything the families could devise, had appeared to break under their extended questioning, but had been feeding them false information while memorizing every detail of their operations. "He's been providing reports for 6 months," Cassidy continued, gesturing for his soldiers to secure the surgical instruments scattered around the room. Every family gathering, every specimen processed, every technique developed, all documented for federal prosecution. Some teachers discover their students planned a lesson. The Mountain families exchanged glances that mixed confusion with growing terror. Their intelligence network hadn't been compromised, it had been infiltrated from the beginning, turned into a federal information gathering operation that used their own methods against them. "The autumn gathering," Constance whispered, her commanding presence crumbling as she understood the scope of federal knowledge. "You know about all the families." 17 educational cooperatives, Cassidy confirmed, consulting notes that perfectly matched the family's own records. "Currently being surrounded by cavalry units positioned throughout the mountain territories. Your conference will proceed as scheduled, but under federal supervision." Behind the soldiers, Emmeline caught sight of familiar faces, federal agents she'd trained with, operatives who'd been reported missing over the past 2 years. They moved with the careful precision of people who'd survived extended captivity and turned that survival into intelligence advantages. "Agent Ashford," Cassidy addressed her directly, "your insertion confirmed final operational details. The family's reaction to federal penetration provided the last intelligence needed for coordinated action." Emmeline's role crystallized with horrible clarity. She hadn't been sent to gather census information or investigate disappearances. She'd been the final piece in a complex operation designed to map and neutralize the entire mountain network. Her capture had been anticipated, planned, designed to trigger responses that revealed the family's true capabilities. The children who'd maintained such frightening composure throughout discussions of murder and preservation now pressed closer to their adult relatives, their winter blue eyes reflecting confusion and fear. They'd been raised to see themselves as evolutionary superior to normal humans, but they were still children facing armed soldiers. "The specimens you've processed," Cassidy announced, his voice taking on judicial formality, "represent federal employees engaged in intelligence operations. The intelligence you've extracted represents classified information obtained under torture. The preservation techniques you've developed represent evidence of systematic murder." Each charge landed like a physical blow, stripping away the academic pretensions the families had built around their activities. They weren't educators or evolutionary pioneers. They were common criminals who'd been operating under federal observation for months. But as the major completed his formal charges, something shifted in Josiah's expression. Not surrender or fear, but calculation. The halberd patriarch was studying the soldiers' positions, counting weapons, assessing tactical disadvantages with the same clinical precision he'd once applied to human preservation. What happens when cornered predators realize they have nothing left to lose? And how many federal agents can survive a final lesson taught by families who've perfected death for 3 generations? The grandfather clock began its chime sequence for 11:07, but this time, its bronze notes would announce not the beginning of educational procedures, but the final examination that would determine whether civilization could truly triumph over appetites refined by decades of mountain isolation. Josiah Halberd's winter blue eyes reflected the lantern flames as he reached for something hidden beneath Winifred's blood-stained apron, his movements deliberate, despite the 12 rifle barrels trained on his chest. The federal forces had planned for resistance, but they hadn't anticipated a family willing to demonstrate their ultimate preservation technique on themselves. The mountain families were about to teach their final lesson that some knowledge dies with its keepers, and some secrets burn too bright to survive in civilized hands. The small glass vial in Josiah's palm contained liquid that caught the light like liquid mercury, its surface reflecting depths that seemed to move independently of the container. Behind him, the visiting families and halberd children gathered closer, their expressions shifting from fear to something resembling religious anticipation. "Winifred's final formula," he announced, his voice carrying the reverence of a priest delivering last rites. 50 years of refinement, distilled into a preservation method that transcends traditional anatomical study. Major Cassidy raised his hand, signaling his soldiers to hold fire. But his expression revealed recognition of something that federal intelligence had missed during months of surveillance. "Put down the vial, Halberd. Whatever you're planning won't change the outcome here." "Outcome?" Josiah's lips curved into that wound-like smile Emmeline had first witnessed in the clearing. "Major, you misunderstand the nature of education entirely. Knowledge doesn't die with its teachers. It transforms, adapts, finds new vessels for preservation." The mountain children began to hum again, but this melody was different from their earlier preservation lullaby. These notes carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the cabin's wooden bones, creating frequencies that made the soldiers shift uncomfortably and caused the lantern flames to flicker in patterns that defied the still air. Constance Blackwood stepped forward, her silver braids catching the unstable light. "The federal government believes it can contain what we've become," she said, her voice weaving through the children's humming like a thread through fabric. "But preservation techniques aren't limited to anatomical specimens. Knowledge itself can be preserved, concentrated, passed between generations, through methods your civilization hasn't discovered." A military field report from 1907 described unusual atmospheric disturbances during the Perdition Ridge operation, including systematic equipment failures and disorientation among troops exposed to coordinated vocalizations from hostile subjects. The humming grew louder, more complex, as additional voices joined from outside the cabin. Through the shattered windows, Emmeline glimpsed figures moving between the trees, not the family's children, but something else. Shapes that moved with human intelligence, but inhuman fluidity, their forms shifting between shadow and substance. "The preservation network extends beyond living families," Thaddeus explained, his young voice carrying impossible authority. "Those who've completed their education continue contributing to collective knowledge. Death is simply another form of transformation." The federal soldiers began to lower their rifles, not in surrender, but in growing confusion. Their trained formations wavered as the humming affected their ability to maintain focus, their tactical precision dissolving into individual uncertainty. "What you're hearing," Josiah continued, uncorking the vial with deliberate ceremony, "is 50 years of preserved consciousness. Every specimen processed, every technique perfected, every secret extracted, all concentrated into educational material that transcends individual mortality. Some knowledge refuses to die quietly." Major Cassidy fought against the disorientation affecting his men, but Emmeline could see his military composure cracking under the assault of sounds that worked directly on nervous system responses. "Federal backup units," he managed to announce, though his voice lacked its earlier authority, surrounding the entire ridge system. "Federal units," Constance replied, "who will discover that some education spreads through contact, observation, proximity to preserved knowledge. Your soldiers will return to their bases, carrying lessons they didn't intend to learn." The implications struck Emmeline like physical blows. The families hadn't just been preserving human remains, they'd been distilling consciousness itself, creating concentrated education that could propagate through contact with anyone who encountered it. Josiah raised the vial toward his lips, but instead of drinking, he shattered it against the cabin floor. The liquid spread across the wooden boards like spilled mercury, but instead of pooling, it began to evaporate into vapor that carried the scent of every herb, every preservation technique, every extracted secret the families had accumulated. The humming reached crescendo as the vapor filled the cabin, and Emmeline watched in horror as the mountain children began to fade, not dying, but becoming translucent, their physical forms dissolving into the concentrated knowledge their families had spent generations preserving. "The autumn gathering," Josiah whispered as his own form began to blur at the edges, "will proceed as scheduled, but not in any location your federal maps can identify." The last thing Emmeline saw before losing consciousness was the grandfather clock's hands spinning backward, its bronze chimes echoing through dimensions that had no relation to normal time or space. When federal forces completed their sweep of Perdition Ridge 3 days later, they found empty cabins, cold hearths, and no trace of the families that census records indicated had lived there for over 50 years. The only evidence of their presence was a collection of leather journals written in languages that no government linguist could identify, and a persistent scent in the mountain air that made veteran soldiers wake screaming from dreams of anatomical lessons they'd never experienced. The official report classified the operation as successful neutralization of hostile mountain settlements, but it failed to mention the soldiers who returned from Perdition Ridge, speaking in clinical terms about preservation techniques they'd never studied, or the gradual spread of unusual disappearances throughout military installations across 3 states. To this day, hikers in the Appalachian system report hearing children's voices humming preservation lullabies in hollows where no families have lived for decades, and every autumn, search and rescue teams note a statistical increase in missing persons reports from people who claimed they were following the scent of wood smoke to ask for directions. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.